It was a perfect Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that feels like it was made for family gatherings. The air was warm, but not too hot, and the smell of freshly grilled meat and homemade desserts wafted through the open windows of Daniel's family house. His parents had always hosted these gatherings, and for as long as I'd known him, I'd been part of them. His relatives were loud, boisterous, and always full of stories. It was a familiar scene, laughter bouncing off the walls, kids running around, and the soft clinking of glasses as they all caught up. But for some reason, today felt different. Maybe it was the tension that had been building in my mind for weeks, or perhaps it was the way Daniel had been acting recently. He was quieter than usual, not as engaged in the conversations, almost as if he were somewhere else entirely. I noticed it more today than I had in the past, but I couldn't figure out what was bothering him. We had always been close, or at least I thought we were. So, seeing him sit there, looking slightly off, made me feel uneasy. His family, on the other hand, was as lively as always. His Uncle Frank was at the center of the conversation, boasting about his latest vacation to Europe, while his cousin Lizzie, who always had a sharp tongue, teased Daniel about his latest career moves. I watched from the side as they poked fun at him, and to my surprise, he didn't respond with his usual sharp wit. Instead, he just smiled weakly and let the teasing go on. I couldn't tell if he was annoyed or just didn't care anymore. The conversation shifted, and someone brought up an old joke they loved to tell about Daniel's laid-back nature, how he could never say no to anyone, even when it came to things he didn't want to do. His cousin Greg, in his usual boisterous manner, grinned and said, "Come on, Daniel, we all know you'd let anyone walk all over you, right? You're just too easygoing." Everyone laughed. Daniel chuckled along with them, but there was an edge to it that I hadn't noticed before. His eyes didn't sparkle like they usually did when he laughed, and his posture slouched as if the weight of the conversation was too much. I felt this strange pull in my chest, this need to do something, to make him feel better. That's when it happened, my impulsive comment. I didn't think it through. I didn't even mean it to be cruel. It just came out. "Yeah, you know, Daniel's such a cuckold sometimes. It's almost like he lets everyone walk all over him," I said, trying to add to the joke, to lighten the mood. I thought it would get a laugh. I thought it would ease the tension that had been hanging between us for days. But instead, the room went dead silent. Every face turned to look at me, but it wasn't the laughter I had expected. It was confusion, mixed with a little discomfort. And then, I saw it, the look in Daniel's eyes. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't even pretending to laugh. His face went pale, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. I tried to laugh it off, to pretend I hadn't said anything out of line. "I'm just kidding, Daniel, come on. You know I didn't mean it like that," I stammered, but the words felt hollow. But nothing could erase that moment. He didn't respond. He didn't even move. And as the silence stretched on, I felt something deep inside me crack. What had I done? The silence that followed my careless comment was unlike anything I had ever felt before. It wasn't just awkward or uncomfortable, it was a kind of stillness that seemed to fill the entire room, pushing out all the warmth and noise that had once been there. My heart began to pound in my chest, and I could feel the blood rush to my face, my palms suddenly slick with sweat. The laughter from earlier had evaporated, and for a moment, no one knew what to say. I turned to Daniel, hoping he'd play along, that he'd crack a smile and dismiss the comment like he had so many times before. But this time was different. His face was pale, his eyes locked on mine, but it wasn't the look of someone annoyed or mildly hurt. It was something deeper, something I couldn't understand. His expression was unreadable, like a mask had come down over him, hiding whatever thoughts or emotions he was experiencing. I could feel the weight of his gaze pressing down on me. For a second, I thought he might say something, tell me to knock it off, or laugh it off as a joke gone wrong. But he didn't. Instead, he stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor, the sound breaking the silence, and every eye in the room snapped to him. The energy had shifted. What had been a light-hearted family gathering moments ago now felt tense, like a storm was suddenly on the horizon. "Daniel?" I called out, my voice shaky, unsure of what to do. He didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, motionless for a few beats, before he slowly turned to face me. His gaze was intense, filled with something I hadn't seen in him before, something raw and almost unrecognizable. "You don't know what you've just done," he said, his voice cracking. There was no anger in his tone, just this profound sadness that I couldn't ignore. His words sent a chill down my spine. "You think you know me, but you don't." "Not really." I felt my chest tighten. My throat constricted, and suddenly, all the words I had intended to say vanished from my mind. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. I wanted to apologize, to tell him I didn't mean it, but I didn't know how. The joke had been innocent in my head, but now it felt like it had unraveled something far bigger than I had ever intended. "You've always thought I was weak," he continued, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "But maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm done with being the person you think I am." I didn't know where his words were coming from, or why this moment felt so much more significant than a simple joke. His family, who had been watching in stunned silence, shifted uncomfortably. I could see their unease, but I couldn't focus on them. All I could do was look at Daniel, trying to understand what he meant. Then, without another word, he walked toward the door. It was almost as if he had made his decision, as if the joke had cracked open something within him that could never be fixed. He reached the door, paused for a moment, and then turned back to look at me one last time. His expression softened for a split second, but it wasn't enough to ease the tension that had settled between us. "I'm done," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And just like that, he left. The door clicked shut behind him, and I was left standing in a room full of silent, shocked faces. His absence was immediate and heavy, like a void had opened up in the space he had just occupied. My stomach twisted as I tried to process what had just happened. What did he mean by done? What had I done to make him walk out like that? And why did it feel like everything in my life had just changed in a matter of seconds? I could still hear the echoes of his words in my head, and I knew, deep down, that something was broken, something between us, something that couldn't be fixed by a simple apology. The minutes after Daniel left felt like hours. I stood frozen, my eyes staring at the door he had just walked through, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. The room around me seemed to blur as the weight of the situation sank in, and a deep sense of regret began to swirl inside me, tightening its grip on my chest. I felt sick, both physically and emotionally. How could I have been so thoughtless? How could I have said something so cruel, even if it was meant as a joke? I had ruined everything. The once vibrant atmosphere of the family gathering was gone, replaced by a thick tension that hung in the air like smoke. Daniel's relatives, who had been laughing and chatting just moments before, now exchanged uncomfortable glances. No one knew what to say. I could feel their eyes on me, their judgment, their silent reproach. I had been the one to spark this disaster, and now, I was the one left to face the consequences. "Do you want me to go after him?" His Aunt Linda asked gently, though there was no real conviction in her voice. She was kind-hearted, but even she knew this wasn't something that could easily be fixed with a simple apology. I shook my head, my throat tight. "No, I don't think I can fix this." My voice wavered as the reality of what I had done set in. I had made a joke about something so personal, something that had clearly hit a nerve with Daniel, and now he was gone. I had pushed him away in a single, careless moment, and I couldn't take it back. His parents, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, finally spoke up. "We never thought you'd say something like that," his mother said softly, her voice filled with disappointment. I could see the hurt in her eyes, and it made me feel even worse. She had always been so warm and welcoming toward me, and now I had disappointed her, too. I wanted to explain, to tell everyone that I didn't mean it like that I had just been trying to be funny, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I explain something so thoughtless, so hurtful? What good would my apologies do when the damage had already been done? I felt a wave of guilt crash over me, the kind of guilt that weighs down your chest and makes it hard to breathe. I had never felt so small, so insignificant. I had always prided myself on being a good partner, on supporting Daniel through everything, but now I had done the one thing I thought I'd never do. I had hurt him, deeply. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't just about the joke. This was about something much bigger, something that had been building up between us for a long time. I sat down at the table, my hands trembling as I stared at the empty chair where Daniel had been sitting. The emptiness around me was suffocating. I thought about the way he had looked at me when he stood up, the sadness and quiet anger in his eyes. It was a look I had never seen before, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I might never see him the same way again. It wasn't just a joke anymore. It was a turning point. The following days felt like an endless blur, a haze of confusion, regret, and growing anxiety. I hadn't heard from Daniel since he walked out of the family gathering, and every attempt I made to reach out was met with silence. My calls went unanswered, my texts left unread, and every minute that passed only deepened the distance between us. I couldn't understand why he was avoiding me so completely, especially after everything we had shared. The guilt gnawed at me, and the weight of my mistake seemed unbearable. I spent hours pacing around our apartment, waiting for him to walk through the door, to come home and explain himself. I was desperate for him to say that it wasn't as bad as I thought, that he wasn't really done with me. But that hope faded with each unanswered message, with each empty moment I spent alone. The silence between us was deafening, and it made me question everything. The worst part was that I didn't know what was going on in his mind. I didn't understand why my joke had hurt him so much, or why it had triggered such a strong reaction. It had been a thoughtless comment, but I never imagined it would push him to the point of walking out, of refusing to even speak to me. There had to be more to it than just that. There had to be something I was missing. I began to replay everything in my mind, the conversations, the small changes in his behavior that I had noticed over the past few weeks. There had been moments when he seemed distant, distracted, as if something was weighing heavily on him. I had assumed it was work-related stress or some other minor issue, but now I wondered if it had been something deeper, something that I had failed to see. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed the signs, that I had ignored the cracks in our relationship until it was too late. Was he really that unhappy with me? Had I been so caught up in my own world that I hadn't noticed how much he had been struggling? I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit around waiting for him to come back, hoping he'd forgive me without any effort on my part. I needed to fix this, to prove to him that I cared, that I was sorry for what I had done. I tried reaching out to his friends, hoping they might know where he was or what he was thinking. But all of them were just as baffled as I was. No one had heard from him, and no one seemed to have any answers. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The uncertainty was unbearable. What if he never came back? What if this was the end? In desperation, I drove to his parents' house, hoping for some clarity. I needed someone to tell me what was going on, to give me some kind of explanation for Daniel's sudden decision to shut me out. His mother answered the door, her face soft with concern, but even she didn't have any answers. "He hasn't called us either," she said, her voice quiet, filled with the same worry I was feeling. "We don't know where he's gone." I felt a lump form in my throat. "Please, tell me he's okay. Is he planning to come back?" She shook her head, looking as helpless as I felt. "I don't know, sweetie. I think you need to give him some space. He's going through something, but he's not ready to talk." The lack of answers was maddening. I was desperate for closure, for some understanding of what was happening, but it seemed like Daniel had disappeared into his own world, shutting everyone out. It had been a week since Daniel walked out, and in that time, I had done everything I could think of to reach him. I sent texts, made calls, and even drove to places I thought he might be, but all of my efforts were met with silence. My heart ached, not just from the loss of him, but from the feeling of helplessness that seemed to consume me. What had started as a stupid, careless joke had spiraled into something much more serious, and the chasm between us seemed to grow wider by the day. Just when I thought I couldn't endure the uncertainty any longer, I received an unexpected text from him. It was brief, almost too short to convey the emotions I was hoping for, but it was a message from him nonetheless: "We need to talk. Meet me at the park tomorrow, 2 p.m. My heart skipped a beat. My first instinct was to drop everything and rush to him, to beg for his forgiveness and make things right. But I knew that wasn't the answer. I had already made that mistake once, thinking that I could smooth things over with a simple apology. No, this time had to be different. I had to face whatever was coming, and I had to do it with the humility and understanding that I had been lacking. The next day, I arrived at the park a few minutes early, my nerves coursing through me. I had no idea what to expect. Would he still be angry? Would he tell me he couldn't do this anymore? Or would he open up and finally explain why he had left, why my joke had affected him so deeply? When I saw him standing by the bench near the fountain, my heart pounded in my chest. He looked different. His expression was still guarded, but there was a weight in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. As I approached him, I could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. I wasn't sure if I was ready for what was to come, but I knew I had no choice. "Daniel," I said softly, my voice trembling slightly. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. I never meant to hurt you." He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. His voice was quiet, almost distant, but there was no anger in it. Just sadness. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his words heavy with something I couldn't quite place. "It wasn't just about the joke, Emma. It was about everything." My stomach twisted. Everything? What did he mean by that? He turned to face me fully, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made me feel vulnerable. "I've been trying so hard to be everything you wanted me to be. The good partner. The strong one. But you," he paused, his face tightening. "You've never really seen me. Not for who I am. You've always seen me through the lens of what you wanted me to be, not who I actually am." I felt a sharp pang of guilt hit me. Of course, I had always admired him for his strength and commitment, but had I really seen him? Had I listened to his struggles, his frustrations, his needs? Or had I been so wrapped up in my own world that I failed to notice the cracks that had been forming? "I'm sorry," I whispered again, my voice breaking. "I never meant to make you feel invisible. I love you, Daniel. I really do. But I've been so focused on the wrong things." He looked away for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the fountain. I could see the conflict in his face, the hurt and the disappointment, but also the longing for something more. After a long pause, he turned back to me, his expression softer now. "I don't know if I can just forget what happened," he said slowly, his voice filled with uncertainty. "But I also don't want to walk away from us. I want to try, Emma. But it's going to take time. I need you to really see me, not just as the person you want me to be, but as who I am, flaws and all." I nodded, feeling tears well up in my eyes. "I will. I promise. I'll do better. I'll listen to you, I'll be there for you, and I won't take you for granted again." We stood there for a moment, the silence between us not uncomfortable but rather filled with the weight of understanding. We had both made mistakes, but we were willing to rebuild, to learn from the pain we had caused each other. It wasn't going to be easy, but at least there was a chance. A chance to heal and to grow together, this time with a deeper understanding of who we really were. As I reached out and took his hand, I realized that this was not the end. It was a beginning, a new chapter in our relationship, where both of us would be seen, heard, and loved for who we truly were.